First of all, I want to apologize for not having a more consistent upload schedule. I've been moving places, and this change to my environment has me about to blow the f*** up.
Alright, let's do some sound testing.
Okay.
Just say whatever.
Right. Tres.
Okay, now again.
Duo.
Right, now try to...
Unos.
Yeah, let's now try to...
Nihil.
Dude, stop.
Nihil.
What is wrong with you?
DLCs. Who's got them? Who wants them? That's rhetorical. What game doesn't have DLCs nowadays? Now, scientifically speaking, DLCs are not made equally. From gripping narrative story expansions to fucking horse armor, DLCs have become so widespread that we kinda take them for granted, or for better or worse, we just kinda tune out. Like seriously, would you care if, say, Ubisoft would release a DLC for any of its games? Hell, I found out that their Avatar game just got a DLC, and I could not be bothered. And that's sad. When you think about it, DLCs can be so much more than mediocre content. They can be fantastic narrative pieces, different ways to play a game, or even explore radically different facets of gameplay. Hell, you could even make more of the same content. If the dedication, ambition, and vision is there, it can make for a really good experience. Now, why have I decided to talk about something that, realistically, people don't really give a fuck about? Well, there is no new game release that I find interesting, and I think this is a pretty good excuse to talk about Elden Ring's DLC. Now, there will be spoilers about Shadow of the Erdtree in the later parts of this video. Until then though, do subscribe, it helps pay the bills. It doesn't, I'm not even monetized yet. And let's talk about what makes DLCs great. To begin with, I want to clarify that I'll be casting a very wide net over what I mean by a DLC. I'll be considering stuff from large expansions to skins. Now yes, I know that as pieces of content the comparison is quite unfair, however, they are, technically, downloadable content. And technically, a DLC doesn't have to be any one thing. You don't have to make skins, or spectacular expansions for that matter, it's all a choice, and one that can and should be held up for scrutiny. So, with that being said, let's start with skins. First try. Skins are at this point the sort of DLC that we don't question anymore. Games nowadays just launch with a price tag of 80 euros and have more than half of their skins locked behind paying more money. Most gamers don't really care about this sort of stuff, but it's indicative of a larger problem. Gaming companies have become increasingly brazen when it comes to cutting content from their games and selling it as DLC for more money. Back around like 10 years ago, Christ I feel old, there was an idea that stuff like skins that are made during a base game's development time shouldn't be sold as additional pieces of content. The argument being that if you take out content that you've made during the development time, you are taking stuff out of what's supposed to be the final product. Skins are a good example because they used to be stuff that was given to you as a reward. Taking them out for the sake of extra cash is lazy and, in an ironic sense, cheap. I remember the time people used to, rightly, lose their shit over this. Bandai Namco famously tried hiding away DLCs on their discs, literally sectioning off content on a physical object you bought. At that point you're not buying content, you're buying access codes, babes. This is the sort of fuckery that made me appreciate a game like Marvel's Spider-Man because of how many costumes are available for free. Regrettably, it seems like the backlash was not strong enough because skins are the least of our worries. Nowadays, it's so common for entire chunks of gameplay to be taken away and sold as DLC, which brings us to our next point. Many big studios are so strapped for cash that their games are launched with entire missions as pre-order or day one DLC. Hell, games like Mortal Kombat often lock a character as extra content on release. Yeah, pre-order now to get Shao Kahn, or Shang Tsung. You know, characters that are iconic for their franchise and play a large role in their stories. You even fight them and they have their full moveset. They were made to be fully functional during the development but got sectioned off for cash. I am genuinely surprised no one gets angry over this sort of stuff anymore. But, in terms of gated missions, honestly, I'm of the opinion that you're not losing much. They tend to be pretty mediocre, which puts them in a very awkward spot of not being anything spectacular while also being paid DLC as if they bring something to the table. But what happens when a DLC is not that? Let's go back to 2012. Mass Effect 3 is one of the most anticipated titles of the year, benefiting from the major success of its previous games and a relatively non-controversial perception. Well, unless we talk about that one time TV news outlets got really mad about being able to fuck aliens. That was wild.
Is somebody gonna match my freak?
What could possibly go wrong? Day 1 DLC. The answer is Day 1 DLC. And frankly, one of the most hated Day 1 DLCs I've ever seen. If you're familiar with the lore of Mass Effect, you know that the Prometheans are very important. They were a race of aliens that vanished because of the same extinction event you are facing. So, someone had the fantastic idea of adding a Promethean companion, and that's great. The gameplay of Mass Effect relies a lot on companions and the many interactions you can have with them. So anyway, they decided to make it a Day 1 DLC. And nobody liked that. It was a terrible choice, not only because of how intricately necessary this character would be to the story experience, but also the fact that this content was created within the development of the base game. So anyway, an important lesson was learned and nobody made the same mistake. Until the very next year. Metro Last Light was highly anticipated after the huge success of Metro 2033. In case you don't know, it's a shooter set in a post-apocalyptic world that features a neat combination of post-nuclear creatures, creepy paranormal events, and the Fourth Reich, because shooting Nazis will never be not fun. Now this is all great, but our problem starts with the original, and its DLC, the Ranger Pack. The important bit here is related to something called the Ranger Mode. It's a mode that completely eliminates HUD elements, making its gameplay a very tense experience. You have to keep track of things like ammo yourself. It's a fantastic thrill. It feels oddly cinematic in situations where you're outside and you don't know how much time you have on your filters, or even how many you have left. It shouldn't come as a surprise that it was so well received that it essentially became part of the Metro experience. Now, for transparency's sake, this DLC was not free on the Xbox, but it was free on Steam, which set the expectation that this mode would make a return in the sequel as a part of the base game. And it did, as Day 1 DLC. Cue another controversy and the follow-up excuse that boggles down to money. And this brings me to point 3. Don't be a dickhead. Don't do it. Don't do it. Zoom. Actually, let me just work on the order here a bit.
One eternity later.
I like to think that this is the order of the 10 Commandments. Don't be a dickhead, don't release shit DLC. If you are taking content out of your game for the sake of money, I know what you're doing, you know what you're doing, we all know what you're doing. Now, yes, while this mode was released as a DLC, through circumstance, like it being free on Steam, the expectation became that it would be part of the base experience, and it turns out that challenging that was a really bad idea. Metro Exodus featured the Ranger mode free of charge. Season passes are essentially a slightly longer and fancier way of saying pre-order. They are bundles that offer a game's DLCs usually at a slight discount before or after the said DLC is released. Now, I should say that the existence of a season pass does not inherently mean that a DLC will be bad, but they are a very negative indicator to me, and here's why. If a game launches with a season pass, this means that DLCs are already to some extent in development. They are planned no matter what because people already have the opportunity to pay for them. And in my opinion, that's bad. When you're releasing a game, you don't know how players will receive it, what they won't like, and what they would want to see from additional content, or even a clear vision of how you could twist its gameplay to make a unique and enjoyable experience that complements the base game. That's the sort of stuff great DLCs do, like switching to Elizabeth as a playable character in Bioshock Infinite's Burial at Sea, or Dishonored's DLC letting you play from Dowd's perspective and giving you his cool abilities. Now, what you will have noticed is that both of these DLCs were actually part of a season pass. Because again, a season pass, or even a lack of it, is not an indicator of a DLC being bad. Bloodborne's Old Hunters was released 8 months later, which is quite typical of a season pass DLC, but Bloodborne did not have a season pass, and yet I'm quite sure that its DLC must have been to some extent in development. Vision and ambition and high production value can overcome the hurdle of just having released a game, and might just let you predict quite well what players want from your DLC. So, does this invalidate my negative feeling towards season passes? Not really. For any Old Hunters, there's 10 DLCs I don't remember. For any Echoes of the Eye, there's 20 DLCs Ubisoft just planned in the past hour. Also, since we talked about Dishonored and Bioshock Infinite, can we also stop with arena/arcade DLCs forever? They may not be on the same level as skins or Day 1 DLCs, but Christ, I must confess, I find them lazy and annoying. They reuse a lot of content, slap some modifiers on it, and add a score system. They're basically adding maths.
Ew!
Don't do it. But aside from that, I feel like you have to play at such a level where things become frustrating, and when things become frustrating, it's easier to spot and be critical about flaws, which I feel like arena and arcade modes frequently show. Like, I remember playing Days Gone's DLC, and it was just so absurd how you had to drift every fucking second and how ramps felt completely random, or how you had to fight a horde of zombies with the game trying to achieve the thrill of a zombie apocalypse and managing to be great. At the concept of running. Don't put these things in, they always show flaws in your game. Now, let's move on to something deeper. Whenever I play most DLCs, I often have a feeling that is off-putting. It's a feeling that I found difficult to explain before. It's like you play a DLC, right, and it feels almost immediately obvious that it's side stuff. It's like a clear lack of effort, budget, or as to what we're discussing now, an irrelevance towards the story. They have a very weak relationship to trying to live up to the same level of fidelity as the main experience, and because they don't even try to come close to that, they just stick out as experiences that don't fit in organically. It's like they put side in DLC, and there is no side in DLC. That was a joke. For a fantastic example of a story done right, you've got Bioshock Infinite's Burial at Sea DLC. It's a two-parter exploring what happened to Elizabeth after the events of the main game, how she couldn't let go and hunts and torments the last version of Booker in existence. It gets pretty dark, with the writing being really high quality and showing a drastically different side to the Elizabeth we knew, while also tying Infinite to the previous two games. At that point, it's been a few years since we've set foot in Rapture, and returning to it was fantastic. Then, in the second part, changing perspectives to Elizabeth is delightful game design. You go from playing this rugged and strong guy to someone more vulnerable, and the gameplay changes accordingly, encouraging you to be stealthy and strategic. And the writing quality, I feel, increases even further. It serves as a surprise prequel to the first Bioshock, culminating in a jaw-dropping plot twist. It showcases Elizabeth's character returning to Rapture without her powers because she could not live with what she did, resulting in an ending that managed to make me emotional. And that's not the sort of thing I can say about most games nowadays, never mind DLCs. It's beautiful, and if I ever replay Bioshock Infinite, this DLC is a must replay. Bloodborne's Old Hunters is another great example, but with a different application. The story of Soulsborne games is rather unique. You walk into a ruined world full of mystery and have to figure it out. By watching VaatiVidya, by exploring and reading. Honestly, it's the only sort of game where people bother reading item descriptions for the sake of lore, which is saying something. Trying to piece together the lore of these games is a very involved process because the story doesn't happen with you, it happens at you. And this narrative technique allows them to create DLCs that feel organic in how they relate to the main game. The Old Hunters is, in my opinion, a superior piece of DLC compared to those released before. Many Dark Souls DLCs up to that point focused on places and narratives that were far more detached from the main plotline. In Bloodborne, Yharnam is a city consumed by their reliance on beastly blood and the influence of the Eldritch Old Ones. Its gameplay is an incredibly satisfying unique twist on Dark Souls combat, its adaptation of Lovecraft's work and its lore is masterful. I know that, you know that, we don't need to argue about it. The Old Hunters is a masterpiece that maintains all of that, there's no loss of quality. The environment and the lore are a fantastic adaptation of Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth, and they tie in beautifully with the base game, as it showcases one of the earliest events that set Yharnam's plot in motion. And the reason it fits in so organically is because I feel that the story in Soulsborne games is somewhat episodic in nature. When you think about it, you barely have a character or a group of characters that are relevant throughout or in every section of the story. They all have sort of like a part of the story and world dedicated to them, so when you add a cast of DLC characters with their own plotline, it fits in a very effortless way. Again, if they were to remaster Bloodborne, the DLC would be a must replay. In contrast, I've recently played Final Fantasy XVI's DLC, and in the story aspect, it very much falters and feels disconnected in the exact way I described before. Its characters are relevant only there, and the content feels very sectioned off from the main story. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that what happens here should have trickled down into the base game. Through these events, Clive becomes a more complete vessel, which could have impacted the finale of the game, but it doesn't explore that possibility. The scope of the DLC is rendered limited and consequently feels strongly separate to the main experience. It also doesn't help that returning to the game for the sake of its DLCs puts me back in touch with how shit its side quests were. Remember, they have so little to say for themselves that one of the earliest ones has you deliver food to people. And it happens twice.
Wow! You If I had a nickel for every time I had to deliver food to random people, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
On my New Game Plus save, I didn't do anything, and seeing them on the map again after all this time is nauseating. One of the DLCs even adds more of them, as if someone asked. But credit where credit is due, there are quite a lot of things that these DLCs do right. One of the best things about Final Fantasy XVI are its crazy boss fights, and the DLCs deliver big time. The fight against Omega is exquisite, it's frantic, insane, beautiful, psychedelic, it's peak Final Fantasy, and nearly makes up for the mediocrity of the DLC. And this brings us to another important point. When it comes to making DLCs, knowing what makes your game good is half of what you need. What makes Echoes of the Fallen and Rising Tide surprisingly good is being able to capture the magic of the boss fights they had in the base game. A lot of these fights make the DLCs really worth taking a look at. Just as well, they kept the principle of making the environment beautiful and huge consistent. Much like in the base game, the faraway environment is absolutely fantastic, genuinely just jaw-droppingly beautiful. And in terms of gameplay, it's not too shabby either. Rising Tide gives you access to Leviathan, and after you're done you also unlock Ultima because they give you their power. Which doesn't make a lot of sense. But much like other icons, they bring a lot of cool and unique abilities to the table, each interacting with the base combat mechanics and benefiting from the game's feature to mix and match abilities however you wish. Then, you also gain access to Kairos Gate, where in a nice touch, it's presented through the UI of its older games. Now, I don't intend to talk about it too much. It does have some neat stuff, but it is an arena-style component. And I already made my thoughts on this sort of stuff pretty clear. Anyway, as far as DLCs are concerned, they were a solid middle-of-the-line experience. Let's go back to Bloodborne for a second, because honestly, it's just that good. A really unique and special thing this game does is that it has a different approach to combat. In Dark Souls, you have lots of weapons, but they all fit in one moveset or another, and just sometimes they have some special moves. In Bloodborne, every weapon is unique, so when you find a new weapon, it feels great. You essentially gain 2 separate movesets that excel at different things and can be changed at any time, in really satisfying ways too, with great sound effect and animation design. The fact that you can even do this mid-combo is just perfection. Each weapon is essentially a new way to play the game in regards to how you approach combat, and its DLC adds 11 of them. That, along with its New Game Plus system, is a lot of replayability right there. And honestly, I think it's a masterwork to be studied, the fact that each weapon is so engaging you'd spend an entire playthrough just to use one and then try another. Its tough but fair approach to boss fights is another thing emblematic of the Souls series, with Bloodborne at the time pushing this system to a faster pace that makes it feel frantic and aggressive compared to the rest of the games. And the old Hunter's bosses are, nearly all of them, peak Soulsborne content. The soundtrack, the movesets, the tempo, these are all things that come together to provide a feel that I haven't experienced before or since. But what makes the old Hunters special in my eyes is that it's part of my running theory that Ludwig's boss fight revolutionized how FromSoft approaches bosses with 2 phases. The moment you enter the arena, you'd think that this is the typical body horror used to be a human but is now a massive beast challenge. But you get to half of his health and you get the sickest second phase transition I've seen in a while. The music syncs up, there's character, and from there the boss fight becomes a different beast, pun intended, entirely. You go from a ruthless beast that charges at you relentlessly to something that is strangely elegant. And look at this thing, it has no right to be called in any way elegant, but the game achieves that feeling. His name changes, his entire moveset down to his posture reverts to that of a knight. This transition is so detailed that even his weaknesses change. And don't even get me started on the soundtrack, how it changes from this creepy horror style to a royal orchestra. I could talk about this for a long time because there's layers and layers of depth and detail here. I enjoyed it so much that I had a backup save for it because I knew I'd want to replay it. The influence of this boss fight is still felt today, as in Elden Ring, for example, Malekith's second phase reveal is clearly evocative of it. Now, let's move on to some honorable mentions. Coming back to a game for the sake of its DLC to experience the same gameplay that you know and love is one thing, but being able to experience its gameplay through a different lens of mechanics can be refreshing and brilliant. Playing as Elizabeth in Burial at Sea is a good example we've already discussed, but if you want a masterpiece, you should absolutely try out Echoes of the Eye from Outer Wilds. It's a DLC I've enjoyed so much that I'd rather not discuss it in this video, the base game too for that matter. I'd much rather dedicate an entire video to them, and maybe I will in the future. They are both fantastic, and if you can, you should absolutely get them and experience them. Do not watch someone else play them, because they're the ultimate examples of a game you cannot replay. Now, the idea of having a DLC interwoven with the main story is a surefire way to succeed in making something worth our time, but what is tantamount to keep in mind is that a base game should be always sufficient on its own. DLCs are best applied when there's intriguing and relevant plot points to explore to make the experience feel as complete as possible. Final Fantasy XVI, for example, had two main things that weren't explored in the story. The first is the Fallen, a civilization of ancient humans that was wiped out a millennia ago by Ultima. What exactly happened to them remained a mystery, and its DLC explored why Ultima was so threatened by them, as their mastery over magic went as far as being able to create their own icon that could wrap reality itself. You also had Leviathan, the missing icon, revealed to be frozen in time. All of this makes Final Fantasy XVI feel complete as a world, and it's very much in keeping with the series' principle of always delivering a complete story with each installment. Well, sometimes. Making a DLC that is more of the same, despite me probably implying otherwise, is fine. I know this sounds like a cop-out, but I'm sure many of you would have had many of this type of DLCs at the top of your mind going into this video. And that is a testament to the fact that at the end of the day, many things like quality, quantity, value for money, ambition, vision, these are all things that we see and we recognize. What you make may not go down in history as the best thing ever, but offering something memorable can be enough. What makes a DLC great is not necessarily any one or any combination of things. It's content that as a player you pick up because you wanted to return to a game you enjoy, and in the end it becomes an undeniable part of the whole experience. Like what the Old Hunters is for Bloodborne or Burial at Sea for Bioshock Infinite. These are examples of experiences that were released as DLCs but now feel like part of the base game itself. And that's what a DLC should strive to be. So now that we have all that corny shit out of the way, let's talk about Shadow of the Erdtree. The DLC that was infamously casually announced in a tweet, so you know they had faith in what they were making. Now, I don't think I need to tell you about Elden Ring, but I do want to focus on the fact that it was released in February 2022. Shadow of the Erdtree was released in June 2024, a full 2 years after the game's release. Remember when I said that I appreciate a substantial break between a game and its DLCs that season passes rarely allow? This is where it plays in. Because of this time lapse of 2 years, I felt quite comfortable with this DLC. I felt confident that FromSoft had enough time to listen to player feedback and build an experience that really complements all the work they've done on Elden Ring. This DLC starts in Mog's Arena, where you have to touch young Miquella. Now this is great. Arguably one of Elden Ring's biggest mysteries is Miquella, a being cursed with eternal youth, which is something that all gays approaching their 30s want to be cursed with. This DLC explores what Miquella has been up to, bringing you to the land of Shadow and quickly reacquainting you with your sense of mortality. Jokes aside, deciding where to start with discussing this DLC is difficult. It's genuinely huge with a lot of things going for it. If I were to compare your regular DLC to the size of this, it would barely be a fraction. One of the best things Elden Ring did, especially considering that it was FromSoft's first time, was its open world. It was huge, with purposeful placement, beautiful environment, and lots of hidden places that you could see from a distance. I don't think I would exaggerate if I were to say that it was a masterclass in designing a world that felt fantastic to explore. This DLC very much keeps in touch with these principles. The map itself is substantial, comparable even to that of the base game. There's loads of new environments. Unique, beautiful, poison swamps. Okay, maybe it's not that great of a DLC. Every single place, of which there are many, is worth interacting with, not only as a piece of gameplay content, but also in a visual sense. A thing that I really like is how FromSoft felt comfortable in making huge places that aren't necessarily about combat or item collection. They're like set pieces to take in, like the mysterious and eerie vibe of the Finger Ruins, or finding the Shaman Village, a place with literally no enemies but where you make the discovery that it was Marika's home. This is fantastic. Whereas many games suffocate their hidden areas in collectibles and other modern gaming bullshit, FromSoft does something different, and it's damn good at what it does. The way environmental design commands expectations from the moment you set foot into a new area is genius. How you can get into the clusterfuck that is Jagged Peak and know you'll fight something too riddle full of holes, with a hail of harpoons. If you know, you know. But what is absolutely delightful is how every single thing you see is something you can explore. I have lost count, and this is, by the way, unironically fucking great. I've lost count of how many times I've looked at something in the distance only to realize that I can get there. Like looking down at a chasm and thinking, well, it's probably nothing there, just an insta-death pit. You can go there. You can go there. You can go there. They have literally used every single inch of this landmass and let none of it go to waste. It's such an interesting way to subvert what you expect from an open world. In normal games, I frequently feel like your exploration is driven by the map literally saying, hey, there's something here. But in this DLC, I explore something because I know there must be something there. Shadow of the Erdtree doesn't take your sense of exploration for granted. It works to gain your trust with content worth finding, and you, organically, end up gravitating towards places you haven't explored. This is what's at the base of another thing that makes the entire experience special, how it plays with your sense of adventure. In the base game, for every single path you follow, you'll find 3 other paths begging for exploration. The game expands before your very eyes with each discovery after discovery, and it makes up these small adventures that culminate in satisfying bosses and lore. Shadow of the Erdtree is able to maintain the same level of fidelity. I had to mentally keep track of any new route because you're always rewarded with a new place at worst and an entire adventure at best. The things that I have experienced purely by virtue of having my curiosity piqued by exploration and adventure have been absolutely worth it. It's great to be reintroduced to the feeling of getting rewarded for this sort of stuff, because this is where most open world games fall, and it's the sort of failure that I've gotten accustomed to at this point. I genuinely just take the idea of an open world for granted, and this DLC woke up something in my mind, a desire for a stronger level design standard that I have forgotten about because no one really tries to live up to it. If that's not enough for you, the game also has secrets aplenty. Side note, bless all of you who actually take the time to leave helpful messages and point players like myself in the right direction. This sort of community functionality is unique to Soulsborne games, and I'm happy that its community makes good use of it. Also, if you're the type to leave messages in front of walls to imply that there's an illusory wall, fuck you. Another facet of this open world design that is great is how there's usually a few ways to get somewhere. It's something very unique to have friends and see posts complaining about some character called Ralana because she's difficult while I never encountered her. People were convinced that she's a mandatory boss while I encountered her after I reached the final boss because I was doing some cleanup. This is the sort of unique experience that this approach to open world connectivity allows. Have the confidence to let players miss things because it can and will result in vastly different playthroughs throughout your community. And let's be honest, if there's any content that we would miss, we would absolutely go back to experience it and seek it out because that's the quality that this game lives up to. And that does of course open up the discussion that we change how we interact with games based on their caliber. Of course I would and have explored the entire map of Elden Ring, and I have done so for many other FromSoft games for that matter. This sort of stuff just wouldn't happen with Ubisoft or EA. If they decide to put effort into a piece of content, they would 100% force it on you sooner or later. And when it comes to optional content, well, it's optional. Not all players are guaranteed to come across it, so why bother? In terms of bosses, I don't think anyone would doubt that FromSoft would deliver. DLC or not, optional or not, the bosses in these games are always of high fidelity to the very concept of quality. There's a lot to enjoy here, from the cinematography to just fighting wild shit. What really hits home for me is that I feel that there's a lot more dedication to making weird and unconventional boss designs. You've got Miss Centipede over here, Saint of the Rosebud, the Scudder avatar being a wilted sunflower, the Dancing Lion being evocative of Asian cultural performances, and then this questline that brings you across the Mother of Fingers. I mean, look at this shit, look at this outlandish design. And then the quest giver, who transforms into this monster in an attempt to become a mother and rebirth his dead child. I know this sounds wild, but it brings me back to the insane designs and lore of Bloodborne, and I absolutely love it. An improvement compared to the base game is that this time around, dungeon bosses are unique. Sure, you might be fighting a Death Knight a few times, but they have unique weapons and abilities. Just as well, there's a less repetition between dungeons, and some of them, like the Jar factories, have such a unique and dark atmosphere while answering questions that honestly, we didn't need answering.
No, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you.
However, this is not to say that there aren't some stinkers here. The aforementioned Erdtree avatar is not my favorite. Its AoE thrown attack feels confusing to interpret, and the main gimmick that makes this boss difficult, really, is the fact that it resurrects 3 times. Then you have Lida's gang fight, which is annoying because no one likes gang fights. And honestly, invasion style fights have been pretty much botched since Bloodborne. Remember how you fight fellow hunters and they pretty much have mountains of HP, infinite bullets, etc. That's one thing I wish would have remained in the past, because this thing was not enjoyable at all. The plotline is essentially about following in Miquella's footsteps, where you, along with various characters, are drawn into this world and find parts of his living body left behind as he enacts his plan. It's full of intrigue, as you come across Mog's body, get hints of a ritual that Miquella wants to perform, and even come across his other half, Saint Trina. She explains that Miquella wants to become a god, but here's where we come across something interesting, another subversion of expectation, if you will. Godhood, or those who pursue it in Soulsborne games, often act in their own interests, but Miquella doesn't. He is the sort of character that is heavily hinted to be genuine in wanting to create a world of compassion. I was actually so convinced of his kindness that if I were given the opportunity to let him go on with his plan, I would have. Bit of a missed opportunity there, I think, and also a fantastic excuse to just skip the final boss of the DLC. But despite his good intentions, he is divine and thus resorts to forcing those he can use towards his goal. Many lore pieces and even the final boss fight confirm that through this unique death message. It's something that is very cool to see if I were able to survive till he grabs me twice. And we will talk about this difficulty issue because it's proven to be quite polarizing. But would you have ever imagined coming back to this game 2 years later and finding people en masse apologizing to Mog? These are the nuances that make Elden's writing so special and engaging. To find that despite his pure intentions, Miquella's actions are still corrupted by the virtue of being divine. No matter their affinity, benevolent or otherwise, those divine will still impose their will as if they have the right to, and it's up to us as lesser beings to resist them. I felt a bit like Vatividia saying that. Now, one of the things that made this DLC somewhat controversial was the final boss, Radahn. He makes a return as the consort of Miquella, and some people, as they usually do when they come across this sort of stuff, lost their shit at the implication that they may be gay, which to me is funny more than anything. Could you imagine having gay sex with Radahn? This is how I think it would sound like.
I'm not ready!
In all seriousness, no, I think it's rather obvious that it's not about them being gay. When it comes to the writing of these games, unions such as these are more about power more than anything. It's not like you wouldn't be able to choose Ronnie's ending if you were playing as a girl, and I haven't seen anyone scrutinizing her for her pesky bisexuality. I think it's pretty clear that Miquella doesn't want Radahn for his big dick like I do. Miquella wanted a vessel, choosing to resurrect Radahn, one of the strongest characters in Elden Ring, using the body of Mohg. In my mind, this makes sense. Many people believe this to be fanservice, thinking that Godwyn might be a more suitable replacement. I don't particularly agree with this, considering that, remember, Godwyn didn't just die, he died in spirit but not body. This is why you see his disfigured body at the roots of the Erdtree. It's actively trying to resurrect him, but because his soul is gone, it doesn't work. Trying to change that would kind of break the story. Radahn, in contrast, still has a soul and thus fits Miquella's plan. Anyway, as far as Radahn is concerned, what I think needs a lot more discussion is the difficulty. And look, I approach this subject fully knowing that the game, by design, is meant to be hard. Despite this DLC being believed to be far more difficult than the base game, I will say that I have enjoyed it. I managed to get to the final boss, again, not defeating it, before the first balance patch dropped, and had a very good time with it despite a few hurdles. I explored nearly every area by day 3, and the difficulty, as far as I'm concerned, has been just right, as long as you use the tools given at your disposal. I'm the sort of player that doesn't find any shame in using the Mimic tier, because the game is literally balanced around it. Now you might say, you've explored everything by day 3? Isn't that a bit much? To which I say that I don't fear Dora the Explorer. Dora fears me. When I walk into the club, Dora says, "Swiper, we got no time for swiping. We got to go." But what I've quite disliked about Elden Ring's boss design is the switch from bosses that are tough but fair to fight, to bosses that do a lot of cool stuff but are otherwise dog shit to fight. It's something that is very strange to see, especially because this has been FromSoft's bread and butter for years. Consort Radahn feels like the epitome of this design. Attack strings that go on and on and on, they correct their movement on the spot, they charge in on you as soon as you step through the fog gate. And that's just the first phase, which I'd argue is infinitely more tenable than what comes next. Promised Consort Radahn is a nightmare. Like, the attacks just don't fucking stop, and they have various follow-ups, and it's just a mess. It's like the concept of being able to attack back doesn't exist. I never thought that trying to land a second attack would be considered greedy. In contrast, I replayed the entirety of the old Hunters on New Game Plus for this video, and I never got to experience this level of frustration at any point. This is the first time ever I was content with not beating a boss and just waiting for a balance fix for it. Call me a casual, I just decided to preserve my sanity because I was not having a good time. So, where does this leave us? Despite me getting quite negative at the end here, I do want to say that my dissatisfaction is not related to a lack of quality, vision, or anything like that. These elements are all there, and they're clearly visible and they're thoroughly appreciated. Shadow of the Erdtree is exquisite. The scale of what it does is something that 99.9% of DLCs don't even try to do. And you know what? I hope this DLC does well. I hope it brings in boatloads of cash. I hope it's so successful that other studios and publishers turn their heads around and study it. After all, there's nothing that gets a gaming company CEO's attention like something that is making millions and isn't theirs. The lack of creativity that we see in the market today is very much indicative of that. Shadow of the Erdtree deserves to shake up this stale market because it establishes a fantastic precedent over what DLCs could and should be. And that's all I have to say for this video. Thanks for watching all the way through, and do like and subscribe to help it out in the algorithm. If you didn't like it because of what I had to say about Elden Ring's difficulty, file a complaint. I'm not sure what I'll pick up next. If you have some recommendations or suggestions, feel free to put them in the comments, and as always, have a lovely day. I chose like the hottest fucking day to record all of this.